Welcome to Serial Labyrinths, the channel where we explore the twisted paths of serial killers and the most chilling true crime stories from around the world. I'm your host, Alberto Lopez. The story I'm about to tell you didn't start with flashing lights or a dramatic arrest. It started with something as ordinary as a Saturday morning hike on a peaceful trail in upstate New York. Imagine this. You're out for some fresh air, leaves crunching under your boots. The kind of day where the biggest worry is whether you remembered bug spray. That's exactly how it felt for that hiker back in September 2021, near the Chautauqua Rails to Trails in the town of Portland, Chautauqua County. Just a regular spot locals use all the time. Families, dog walkers, people clearing their heads. But on this particular day, things took a turn nobody saw coming. The hiker spots something half buried in the dirt off the path. At first it looks like trash, maybe an old bag or bones from an animal. But as they get closer, it's a human skull. And right there, less than 20 yards away, another set of remains. 2 bodies, dumped in the same remote stretch of woods. But here's the crazy part. Investigators would later prove they'd been left there almost 2 decades apart. And that's when things took a turn from weird find to something much darker. The first body they could identify pretty quickly was a 50-year-old woman named Marquita Mull from Buffalo. From her perspective, life hadn't been easy. She lived near the Broadway Market area, one of those neighborhoods where everybody knows everybody, where folks still wave from their porches. Her sister Wendy had reported her missing that summer of 2021 after Marquita just vanished one day. No note, no call, nothing. Wendy told police her sister had been dealing with some tough stuff, like a lot of people do. But she was loved. She had family checking in. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next, but one thing was clear. Marquita never came home. And when her skeletal remains turned up in that tote bag off the trail, it hit her family like a freight train. But this wasn't some random dumping spot. It was personal. It was calculated. Fast forward a few weeks, and the second set of remains, those older bones, were still a Jane Doe. But here's where it gets really interesting. Investigators from the Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office weren't giving up. They sent samples off to labs, including a specialized one in Texas called Othram Labs that uses genetic genealogy. And after months of waiting, boom, they got a hit. The woman was Cassandra Watson, about 40 years old when she disappeared from Buffalo around 2003 or 2004. That was nearly 20 years earlier. Her family hadn't heard from her in all that time. Relatives said she was last seen living with a guy in the city. Everyday stuff, sharing rent, trying to make it work. But what they didn't know was that the man she was living with had a past that would turn this whole thing upside down. Now here's where it gets really strange. Both women, Cassandra and Marquita, had the remains tossed in almost the exact same spot on that trail. One killed around 2003, the other in June 2021. Detectives started connecting dots. They dug into Cassandra's life and learned she had been in a relationship with a local man named Richard Fox. From his perspective, he was just a handyman. The guy neighbors called when the sink leaked or the porch needed fixing. Quiet, unassuming. The kind of person you wave to at the mailbox and never think twice about. But the deeper they looked, the more the picture started to shift. Richard Fox wasn't some stranger. He grew up right near that trail, on Wollabin Road in Portland, about a half-mile from where the bodies were found. He knew those woods like the back of his hand. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. because while they were piecing together Cassandra's story, they ran his name through the system and saw he was a registered sex offender. Convictions going back years. But we'll get to that. Right now, in late 2024 and early 2025, the investigation was heating up fast. They linked Fox to both women through timelines, locations, and evidence that just kept stacking up. And that's not even the weirdest part. In January 2025, they arrested Richard Fox in Niagara Falls, a 62-year-old handyman suddenly sitting in handcuffs, charged with 2 murders spanning decades. The community was stunned. Neighbors described him as helpful, polite, the guy who'd fix your fence for a 6-pack. But behind closed doors, something else entirely. The sheriff himself, James Quattrone, would later call him a serial killer outright. But at this point, it was just the beginning. And just like that, a simple hike on a trail had ripped open a nightmare that had been hiding in plain sight for over 20 years. Families who had waited decades for answers were finally getting movement. But nobody really knows for sure what happened next in those woods, or in the homes where these women last lived. Because the more they uncovered about Richard Fox, the clearer it became that this trail of bones was only the start. But before we get into that arrest and what happened in those courtrooms, let's hit pause for a second and go back, way back. Because the thing is, Richard Fox didn't just appear out of nowhere in 2025 with 2 bodies on a trail. Keep in mind, this guy had been walking among us for decades, fixing roofs, patching drywall, waving at neighbors like he was just another regular Joe in upstate New York. Imagine this, a quiet kid growing up in the small town of Portland, right on Wollobin Road, maybe a half-mile from that very same Chautauqua rails to trails path where those remains would eventually turn up. From his perspective, life probably looked normal on the surface. School, chores, the kind of everyday stuff that makes you blend right in. Nobody really knows for sure what was brewing inside, but here's where it starts to get really dark. Fast forward to the early 90s, and Richard Fox is already showing signs that something was seriously off. In 1993, he gets convicted of third-degree rape involving a minor. And get this, some reports say it wasn't a one-time thing. Allegations pointed to years of abuse right there in the family home while he was living in a stepdad-type role. Sentenced to 18 months to 3 years. Not exactly a slap on the wrist, but nowhere near what you'd think for that kind of horror. And just like that, he's back out in the world, still calling himself a handyman, still living in the Buffalo area. What they didn't know was that this wasn't the end of the pattern. It was only the beginning. Now here's where it gets really interesting. After that first stint, Fox keeps a low profile for a while. Neighbors later described him as helpful, reliable, the guy you'd call if your gutters were clogged or your door wouldn't lock right. Polite, quiet, the kind of man who blended into the background so well that you almost forgot he was there. But the thing is, behind closed doors, the darkness was building. Fast forward to 2005, and boom, another conviction. This time it's first-degree attempted rape and aggravated sexual abuse. The victim was a 42-year-old woman he was actually living with on the west side of Buffalo. Everyday relationship stuff on paper. Sharing rent, sharing space, trying to make it work. But from her perspective, it turned into a nightmare. He got 15 years for that one. And remember, this is a registered sex offender now, level 3, the highest risk category in New York. That means authorities knew he was dangerous. They had him on the registry. People in the neighborhood could look him up if they wanted. But here's the crazy part. Even with all that on his record, he still managed to move around, rent houses, fix things for folks, and slip through the cracks like nothing had ever happened. And that's when things took a turn that nobody saw coming, at least not yet. By the time the 2010 rolled around, Richard Fox is out again, back to his handyman life in the Niagara Falls and Buffalo area. He's got that quiet reputation, the guy with the toolbox who shows up on time and doesn't talk much. But keep in mind, every time he walked into someone's home to fix a leak or board up a window, there was a history trailing behind him like a shadow. 2 violent sex crime convictions, time served, registry status. And yet, life went on. Neighbors didn't know the full story. Families didn't connect the dots. The system had done its paperwork, but the monster was still free to roam. Now here's where it gets really strange. While all this was happening, Richard Fox was living just a stone's throw from those woods in Portland. The same peaceful trail where hikers would one day stumble onto those bones. He knew every back road, every hidden spot. From his perspective, maybe he thought he'd gotten away with everything. Maybe he believed the past was buried deep enough. But what they didn't know was that the trail wasn't just a dumping ground. It was practically his backyard. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Because those sex offender convictions weren't random. They painted a terrifying pattern, targeting vulnerable people, using trust to get close, then striking. The handyman who fixes your house by day and something else entirely by night. Investigators would later learn that even during the years between those convictions, Fox was bouncing around rental houses in Niagara Falls and Buffalo. One of those places, a house on Orleans Avenue, would eventually become infamous. But we're not there yet. Right now, in the timeline of his hidden past, he's just the registered sex offender handyman with a rap sheet that should have set off every alarm bell in the county. And just like that, the stage was set. 2 women, Cassandra Watson in the early 2000s and Marquita Mull decades later, were about to cross paths with the same man. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next in their lives, but we do know how it ended on that trail. And that's not even the weirdest part. Because while the sex crimes were on record for anyone to see, the very first brush with true darkness, the one that happened when Richard Fox was only 13 years old, stayed hidden for almost 50 years. We'll circle back to that one later, because it's like something out of a movie, the kind that makes your stomach drop. For now, just keep in mind, this handyman wasn't some sudden monster who snapped in 2021. The pattern was there all along. Convictions, registry, quiet life in plain sight. The thing is, nobody connected it to those 2 sets of remains until it was far too late. For now, we leave Richard Fox's early rap sheet behind and step into the life of the first woman whose bones would one day rest beside another on that lonely trail. But before we get into that, let's talk about Cassandra Watson. She wasn't some stranger grabbed off the street. This was a woman who was living with Richard Fox himself, sharing the same roof, the same daily routine, right there in the city of Buffalo, around 2003 and 2004. Imagine this. You're a 40-year-old woman named Cassandra, born in 1963, just trying to make it in Buffalo like so many others. The West Side, everyday apartment life, the kind of place where rent's tight, but you figure you'll get by. From her perspective, Richard Fox probably seemed like a decent enough guy at first. He was the handyman, after all, the one who could fix whatever needed fixing. He was already in his early 40s, quiet, polite on the surface, the kind of man who showed up with a toolbox and didn't make a big scene. The thing is, they were in a relationship. They were living together. Day in, day out, coffee in the morning, small talk, the usual couple stuff that millions of people do without thinking twice. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next behind those closed doors, but here's where it starts to get really dark. Fast forward through those early 2000s days, and Cassandra simply vanishes. No big missing persons report. No frantic family calls to the police that made the evening news. The thing is, she wasn't even listed as missing with law enforcement at the time. Her relatives later said they hadn't heard from her in years, but life has a way of drifting people apart, especially back then before everybody lived on their phones. And just like that, Cassandra Watson dropped off the face of the earth. What they didn't know was that she had already become another statistic in Richard Fox's hidden history. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Investigators would later piece together that she was killed, strangled, they believe, right there in Buffalo. And then, in a move that still chills people to the bone, her body was transported nearly 50 miles southwest to that remote stretch of the Chautauqua Rails to Trails in Portland, right near Wollabin Road, right in the backyard of the town where Richard Fox grew up. He knew those woods. He knew how quiet they stayed at night. Keep in mind, this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment dump. This was deliberate. This was calculated. Her remains, skeletal by the time they were found, were placed in a shallow grave, almost like he was trying to make sure she stayed hidden forever. But wait, it gets worse. For almost 20 full years, nobody knew who those older bones belonged to. The hiker who stumbled on them in September 2021 found 2 sets of remains that day, one fresh, one ancient. The newer one was Marquita Mull. The older one? Still a Jane Doe for years. The Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office worked it hard, but traditional methods hit a wall. Fast forward to late 2024 and early 2025. Enter Othram Labs, that specialized genetic genealogy outfit down in Texas that's cracked more cold cases than most people realize. They took DNA from those decades-old bones, built a profile, and started searching family trees. And boom, in December 2024, they got the hit. The remains belonged to Cassandra Watson, the woman who had been living with Richard Fox back in 2003 or 2004. She had trusted the wrong man. She had gone to sleep one night in her own home and never woke up again. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Because once they had her name, the next question was obvious. Who had she been closest to right before she disappeared? The answer pointed straight at the handyman. Now here's the crazy part. Richard Fox wasn't some random suspect they pulled out of thin air. He had been living with her. He had access to her. And once investigators connected those dots, the relationship, the timeline, the fact that the dump site was practically his childhood backyard, Everything started clicking into place like a nightmare puzzle. They exhumed more evidence, ran more tests, and the picture became undeniable. Cassandra's body had been carried out of Buffalo, driven to Portland, and left in those woods like she was nothing more than trash to be forgotten. While her family had quietly wondered for 2 decades what happened to her, Richard Fox had been walking free the entire time, fixing people's houses, living his quiet handyman life, registering as a sex offender for other crimes, sure, but never for this. Nobody really knows for sure what he was thinking in those years between 2004 and 2021, but one thing is crystal clear. He had gotten away with it once. And just like that, the trail of bones on that peaceful hiking path was no longer a mystery. It had a name, it had a face, it had a story that started with an everyday relationship in Buffalo and ended in a shallow grave 50 miles away. The thing is, when the genetic genealogy finally gave Cassandra her name back, it didn't just solve a cold case, it opened the floodgates. Because if Richard Fox had done this to the woman he was living with in 2003, what else had he been doing in the years since? And remember, this is only the first victim we're talking about right now. The second one, Marquita Mull, was found right beside her, almost like he couldn't stop returning to the same spot, like the trail itself had become part of his twisted ritual. To this day, families and investigators still wonder about the exact last moments of Cassandra Watson's life. Did she see it coming? Did she fight? Did she ever suspect the man fixing things around the house was actually the monster who would end her? Nobody really knows for sure what happened next in that Buffalo apartment. But we do know how the story ended on that trail. And that's when things took a turn that would eventually drag a third victim into the light. With Cassandra Watson finally given her name back after 20 silent years, the investigators turned their full attention to the second set of remains found less than 20 yards away on that same quiet trail. But before we get into the courtroom drama that came later, let's talk about the woman whose body was discovered almost immediately. The one that hit her family like a lightning bolt. Keep in mind, this case was fresh. This one still had people out there searching, hoping, praying she'd just walked away and would come home any day now. Picture this. It's late June 2021 in the city of Buffalo. The kind of sticky summer where the Broadway market area still buzzes with life. Folks grabbing fresh produce, waving to neighbors, the smell of street food mixing with the heat rising off the pavement. That's the world Marquita Mull knew. 50 years old, living right there in that tight-knit neighborhood near Broadway, the kind of place where everybody still looks out for each other, even if life's been rough. From her perspective, it was just another ordinary stretch of days. Maybe dealing with some personal struggles like so many of us do. But she had family who cared. Her sister Wendy was especially close, always checking in. The kind of sibling bond that doesn't need daily texts to stay strong. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next, but one day in late June, Marquita simply didn't come home. No note, no call, just gone. And that's when things took a turn from maybe she's staying with a friend to pure panic. Wendy Mull did what any loving sister would do. She reported her missing to the Buffalo police. She searched the streets herself for months. She put up flyers, called everyone who might have seen her, refused to let the trail go cold. The thing is, Marquita wasn't the type to just vanish without a word. Her family knew that. Friends knew that. But what they didn't know was that she had crossed paths with the wrong man. A man who had already gotten away with murder once, almost 20 years earlier. And just like that, another woman from Buffalo had disappeared in broad daylight, right in her own neighborhood. Fast forward to September 26, 2021, that peaceful Saturday when the hikers stumbled onto those bones off the Chautauqua Rails to Trails in Portland. Remember, the first thing they found was the older skull belonging to Cassandra. But right there, less than 20 yards away, wrapped in a tote bag and partially buried, was Marquita. The identification came shockingly fast. Dental records, fingerprints, the works. Within weeks, they knew exactly who she was. And here's where it gets really interesting. Unlike Cassandra, who had never even been reported missing back in 2003, Marquita's family had been sounding the alarm for months. Wendy had been out there every single day, refusing to give up. So when that call came, the one no family ever wants to get, it shattered them. This wasn't some random dump site in the middle of nowhere. It was the exact same stretch of woods where Cassandra had been left almost 2 decades earlier. Same trail, same quiet little town, same monster. Now here's where it gets really strange. On paper, Marquita Mull had almost no obvious connection to Richard Fox. She wasn't living with him. She wasn't dating him. She wasn't even in the same social circle as far as anyone could tell at first. But the investigators weren't buying the coincidence. Keep in mind, by this point they already had Richard Fox in their sights because of Cassandra. They started digging deeper. Phone records, timelines, witness statements, anything that could link the two cases. And boom, the evidence started piling up like bricks in a wall nobody could climb over. DNA, locations, the fact that Fox knew those woods like his own backyard. From Marquita's perspective, she probably thought she was just going about her day in Buffalo that June afternoon. Maybe she ran into someone she knew. Maybe she trusted the wrong face. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next in that moment, but we do know how it ended. Her body transported 50 miles away and left right beside the woman Fox had killed years before. Almost like he was returning to the same hiding spot, like it had become his own personal graveyard. And that's when things took a turn that made the whole case explode. Once they linked Marquita to Fox, the quiet handyman from Portland suddenly went from person of interest to prime suspect in 2 murders spanning nearly 20 years. The sheriff's office moved fast. By January 2025, they had him in custody in Niagara Falls. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Because while Cassandra's story had been hidden in silence for decades, Marquita's family had been living the nightmare in real time, searching, hoping, and then getting that devastating confirmation that she'd been taken and discarded like she was nothing. Wendy stood strong through all of it. To this day, she still talks about her sister with that raw love that only family can carry. But what they didn't know back in those summer months of 2021 was that the man responsible had already done it before, and he wasn't finished yet. But wait, it gets worse. While the world was still reeling from the 2 bodies on the trail, Richard Fox was already living his everyday life again, fixing houses, waving at neighbors, slipping through the cracks one more time. The thing is, dumping two women in almost the exact same spot wasn't random. It was a pattern. It was a signature. And just like that, the peaceful hiking trail that families used every weekend had become something out of a horror story. A place where two lives ended and two families were left asking the same impossible questions. Why her? Why there? Why him? And that's not even the weirdest part. Because even as the charges for Cassandra and Marquita were stacking up, investigators were about to uncover a third woman whose story would take this case from double murder to full-blown serial killer territory. A woman whose remains weren't left on a trail at all, but hidden right inside one of Fox's old houses, under a staircase, boarded up like a secret he thought would stay buried forever. And just like that, while the trail of bones in Portland had already given us two names and two grieving families, the story was nowhere near over. Keep in mind, Richard Fox was already behind bars by January 2025, sitting in a cell after being charged with the murders of Cassandra Watson and Marquita Mull. Most people figured that was the end of it. Two women, one killer, case closed. But here's where it gets really interesting. Investigators weren't satisfied. They started digging into every house Fox had ever lived in, every address tied to his handyman life. And that's when things took a turn that made everyone realize this quiet 62-year-old wasn't just a double murderer. He might be something far worse. Imagine this. It's March 2025 in Niagara Falls, New York. The kind of early spring day where the wind off the river still bites, and folks are just starting to shake off winter. A team of detectives from Niagara Falls PD, working with Buffalo Homicide and the Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office, shows up at an old apartment building on 2419 Orleans Avenue. From the outside, it looks like any other run-down rental, peeling paint, quiet street, the kind of place where people come and go without much notice. But from Richard Fox's perspective, this building was familiar ground. He had lived there. He had worked there as the handyman, fixing things for the owner, walking those halls like he owned the place. The thing is, nobody really knows for sure what happened next inside those walls back in January 2023. But we're about to find out. They get a search warrant and start tearing the place apart, room by room, looking for anything that might tie Fox to more victims. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Down in the basement, they noticed something off about the staircase. The space underneath it had been boarded up, sealed tight like someone didn't want anyone looking inside. They pry it open, and that's when the horror hit. Wrapped in plastic and a tarp, hidden like a secret no one was ever supposed to find, were near skeletal human remains. A body that had been there for over 2 years, decomposing in the dark, right under the stairs of a house where people had been living their everyday lives above it. Fast forward through the autopsy and the lab work, and boom, dental records give her a name. Crystal Curthoys, 32 years old. From Lockport, but she had been staying right there in that Niagara Falls building shortly before she vanished. Now here's where it gets really strange. Crystal wasn't some random stranger to Fox. She was living in the very apartment building he used to call home. She trusted the environment enough to be there. From her perspective, it was probably just another chapter in a tough life, trying to get by, maybe dealing with the same struggles so many young women in that area face. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next in January 2023, but investigators believe Fox killed her right there in that building. Strangled, they think, just like Cassandra. And then, instead of driving her out to the trail like the others, he did something even more calculated. He wrapped her up, dragged her down to the basement, and sealed her behind those stairs like she was nothing more than insulation or old junk, boarded it up, walked away. And just like that, he went back to his handyman life, while Crystal's family wondered where she had gone. But wait, it gets worse. For over 2 years, that poor woman's remains sat right there under the stairs, while tenants came and went upstairs. Kids might have played in that basement. People fixed their coffee in the morning without ever knowing what was hidden just a few feet below. The thing is, if Fox hadn't already been arrested for the trail murders, nobody might have ever looked. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just another body. This was the third strike. And that's not even the weirdest part. Because when they identified Crystal in late 2025, the Niagara County District Attorney moved fast. On December 22, 2025, they charged Fox with her murder, second-degree murder, even though he was already serving time for the first two. Fast forward to January 29, 2026, just a couple of months ago, and Richard Fox stands in Niagara County Court and does something that shocked even the hardened investigators. He pleads guilty. He admits it. He admits he killed Crystal Curthoys in January 2023 and hid her body under those boarded up stairs. And just like that, the handyman from Buffalo officially became a triple murderer on paper. The judge hasn't sentenced him on this one yet. That's coming in April. But he's already looking at another 25 years to life stacked on top of the 40 he got for Cassandra and Marquita. Keep in mind, this guilty plea didn't come with tears or excuses. It was cold, matter of fact, like he was just checking off another item on a list. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Because Crystal Curthoys wasn't dumped on a hiking trail for hikers to find years later. She was hidden in the walls of a house, like a ghost trapped in the foundation. Her family finally got answers after years of not knowing, but those answers came with the kind of horror that no one should ever have to hear. The thing is, finding her under those stairs didn't just add a third victim. It proved the pattern was still going strong in 2023, years after his sex offender convictions, years after the first murder, right in the middle of his quiet handyman routine. But here's the crazy part. Even with 3 guilty pleas now on the books, investigators and the sheriff weren't done talking. They started saying out loud what a lot of people had been thinking. This guy might have done a lot more than 3. And that's when things took a turn that dragged us all the way back to 1976, to a 13-year-old boy and his own grandmother. A murder so old it had been sitting in a cold case file for almost 50 years. Nobody really knows for sure how it all connects, but we're about to find out. And just like that, with Crystal Curthoys finally pulled out from under those boarded up stairs, and Richard Fox pleading guilty to her murder in open court, the body count had officially hit 3. But before we get into the sentencing and the sheriff's warnings, let's rewind all the way back to a summer day in 1976. Keep in mind, this part of the story was buried so deep that even the people who lived through it thought it would stay forgotten forever. Imagine this. It's July 1976 in the tiny town of Brant, New York, a quiet rural spot where everybody knows everybody, and Kane Road is just another stretch of country houses. Beatrice Meben was probably just going about her day like any grandmother would, maybe fixing lunch, watching the world go by from her front window, the kind of ordinary afternoon where the biggest excitement is a neighbor stopping by to chat. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next inside that house, but here's where it starts to get really dark. A neighbor finds her lying on the floor, stabbed multiple times in the chest. She's still alive, barely, and as the first responders rush in, Beatrice manages to speak. She looks them right in the eye and says it was her grandson who did this to her, her own 13-year-old grandson. They rush her to the hospital, but she doesn't make it. She dies from those wounds. And just like that, a 49-year-old cold case is born. The thing is, back in 1976, nobody followed up the way they would today. No DNA, no deep background checks, no genetic genealogy. The case quietly faded into the files, marked unsolved, while life in Brant moved on. What they didn't know was that the boy who had just become a killer at 13 would one day grow up to become the handyman who left bodies on trails and in basements. Fast forward almost 5 decades, all the way to January 2025. Investigators from the Chautauqua County Sheriff's Office and Brant Police are deep into the Richard Fox case, connecting him to Cassandra Watson and Marquita Mull on that Portland trail. They start digging into his childhood, his family, every address he ever touched. And remember, this is where it starts to get really interesting. They come across the old Brant file, the stabbing on Kane Road. The victim's name rings a bell, Beatrice Meeben. And when they check the family connection, boom, she was Richard Fox's grandmother. The same Richard Fox they now had in custody. Now here's where it gets really strange. They sit him down in that interview room and lay the old case file in front of him. They tell him what they found. And instead of denying it, instead of claiming he was just a kid who didn't know what he was doing, Richard Fox confesses. Right there. He admits he stabbed his own grandmother to death when he was 13 years old. No big dramatic breakdown, no tears on camera. Just a calm admission, like he was finally letting go of a secret that had been rotting inside him for half a century. And just like that, the ghost of Beatrice Meeben finally got her name spoken out loud again. But wait, it gets worse. Because Beatrice had actually identified her killer before she died. She told the first responders it was her grandson. Yet for some reason the case was never properly pursued back then. The boy was 13, a juvenile. So even if they had charged him, the system would have treated it differently. And that's when things took a turn nobody could have predicted. That 13-year-old killer grew up, racked up sex offender convictions, and then started leaving women's bodies in the woods and under staircases. From his perspective, maybe he thought the first kill was just a one-time nightmare that got buried with time. What they didn't know was that it was only the beginning of a pattern that would stretch across 50 years. And that's not even the weirdest part. Because when Brant Police announced this confession in January 2026, they made it official. Since Fox was a juvenile in 1976, they can't charge him now. No new trial, no extra sentence. The case is simply closed with his admission. But here's the crazy part. This confession pushed his known victim count to 4. 4 lives. One starting when he was barely a teenager. And remember, the sheriff had already been saying out loud that he believed there were at least 2 or 3 more victims out there. Nobody really knows for sure what happened in the years between that 1976 stabbing and the trail murders decades later, but the pattern is unmistakable now. Trust, violence, hiding the bodies, and moving on like nothing happened. To this day, people in Brant still talk about that house on Kane Road. They wonder what could make a 13-year-old do something so unthinkable to his own grandmother. And just like that, the quiet handyman from Buffalo wasn't just a modern-day monster. He had been one since childhood. The thing is, every time investigators thought they had reached the bottom of Richard Fox's darkness, another layer peeled back. And this one, the grandmother he stabbed in 1976, proved that the evil didn't start on that hiking trail. It started in a family home when he was still a boy. But here's the part that really chills you. While Beatrice Meben's ghost had finally been put to rest with that confession, the living families of Cassandra, Marquita, and Crystal were still waiting for full justice. And the sheriff wasn't done talking. He stepped up to the microphones and said something that made the whole region go quiet. Richard Fox wasn't just a killer. He was a serial killer, and there might be more bodies waiting to be found. And just like that, with Richard Fox's chilling confession about stabbing his own grandmother still echoing in the interview room, the investigators and the public finally had to face what they'd been circling for months. But before we get into the final chapter of this nightmare, let's rewind just a little to November 20th, 2025, the day the courtroom in Erie County filled with families who had waited years, sometimes decades, for this moment. Keep in mind, at that point, Fox had already pleaded guilty to the murders of Cassandra Watson and Marquita Mull. 2 women, 2 different decades, 1 monster. And the judge was about to make sure he never walked free again. Imagine this. The courtroom is packed. Family members sit stone-faced in the gallery. Wendy Mull, still carrying that raw grief for her sister Marquita, is there. Relatives of Cassandra Watson, who had wondered for 20 years what happened to her, are sitting just a few rows back. From their perspective, this was supposed to be the day they finally got some kind of closure. Nobody really knows for sure what was going through Richard Fox's mind as he stood there in his orange jumpsuit. But the thing is, he looked like the same quiet handyman everyone had trusted for years. And that's when things took a turn that made the whole room go still. Judge Suzanne Maxwell Barnes looks him dead in the eye and hands down the sentence. 40 years to life. 2 consecutive terms of 20 years to life, 1 for each woman. She didn't mince words. She told him straight up, "The sentence that I am about to impose will ensure that you will never be in a position to harm another individual, another woman, ever again." And just like that, the handyman who had slipped through the cracks for half a century was finally locked away. But wait, it gets worse. Because right after the gavel came down, Chautauqua County Sheriff James Quattrone stepped up to the microphones outside the courthouse and said something that sent a chill through every person listening. He called Richard Fox a serial killer. Out loud, on record. And then he dropped the bombshell nobody wanted to hear. He believes Fox is responsible for at least 2 or 3 more slayings that are still out there unsolved. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Keep in mind, this wasn't some off-the-cuff comment. Sheriff Quattrone had been deep in this investigation from the very first bones found on that trail. He'd seen the pattern up close, the way Fox returned to the same dumping ground, the way he hid bodies in basements, the way he targeted vulnerable women who trusted him. From the sheriff's perspective, 3 known victims, and now 4 with the grandmother, weren't the end of the story. They were just the ones we'd found. The thing is, there are cold cases all across Western New York. Women who vanished in the Buffalo and Niagara area over the decades. And investigators are now quietly reopening files with Fox's name attached. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Because if the sheriff is right, there are families out there right now who still don't know what happened to their daughter, their sister, their mother. And the answers might be buried somewhere only Richard Fox knows. Fast forward to the weeks after that sentencing, and the confessions kept coming. First, Crystal Kurthoys under the stairs, then the grandmother in 1976, Each new admission just proved the sheriff right. And that's not even the weirdest part. Because even after pleading guilty to 3 murders and admitting to a 4th from his childhood, Fox still hasn't said a word about any of the others. No remorse, no details, just silence. What they didn't know was that the man they'd just sentenced to 40 years to life might have been killing for almost 50 years straight. Nobody really knows for sure what happened next in all those quiet houses and back roads he worked on as a handyman. But the fear is real. And just like that, the trail of bones in Portland wasn't just a double murder anymore. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The basement in Niagara Falls wasn't an isolated horror. It was part of a pattern. The grandmother's ghost wasn't a one-off juvenile crime. It was the spark that started a lifetime of darkness. But here's the crazy part. Even with Fox locked up, the sheriff made it clear he's not stopping. His office is actively working with other departments, pulling old files, retesting evidence, talking to anyone who might remember something from 20 or 30 years ago. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark for the rest of us. Because if there really are 2 or 3 more victims out there, that means there are families still waiting for that knock on the door, the one that finally brings answers instead of more questions. To this day, Sheriff Quattrone's warning still hangs over Western New York like a shadow. People look at their neighbors differently now. The quiet handyman fixing your fence? The guy who's always polite and shows up on time? You can't help but wonder. And that's when things took a turn that changed how a whole community sees the world. The thing is, we may never know the full number. Fox could take those secrets to his grave. Or maybe, one day, another set of remains will turn up in some forgotten basement or stretch of woods, and another family will finally get the truth they've been praying for. And just like that, with the ghost of his grandmother finally laid to rest, and 3 women officially on the books, Richard Fox stood in that courtroom one last time, while the rest of us tried to make sense of a lifetime of darkness. But before we wrap this whole nightmare up, let's sit right there in Erie County Court on November 20th, 2025, the day the gavel finally came down and the handyman from Buffalo learned he would never walk free again. Keep in mind, by this point, he had already pleaded guilty to Cassandra Watson and Marquita Mull. The trail of bones had names. The families had waited years, sometimes decades, and from their perspective, this was supposed to be the moment they could finally breathe. Imagine this. The gallery is packed. Wendy Mull sits there, still carrying the weight of searching for her sister for months in the summer of 2021. Relatives of Cassandra Watson, who had wondered for 20 long years, are just rows behind. The room is quiet, except for the occasional sniffle. Nobody really knows for sure what Richard Fox is thinking as he stands there in his orange jumpsuit. But the thing is, he doesn't look like a monster. He looks like the same quiet guy who once fixed your porch. And that's when things took a turn that made the whole room feel heavier than the air itself. Judge Suzanne Maxwell Barnes looks him straight in the eye and says the words nobody in that courtroom will ever forget. She calls him pure evil. She tells him, "I can honestly say you should never see the light of day again." Evil. That is the one word that sums up this case. Evil. And just like that, she hands down 2 consecutive terms of 20 years to life. 40 years to life total. The kind of sentence that means Richard Fox will die behind bars. The families in the gallery let out breaths they'd been holding for years. Some cried, some just stared. Now here's where it gets really strange. Fast forward to January 29th, 2026, just a couple of months ago, and Fox is back in Niagara County Court, pleading guilty to the murder of Crystal Curthoys. He admits he killed her in that Niagara Falls apartment building in January 2023 and hid her under those boarded-up stairs. Another 25 years to life stacked on top when sentencing comes in April. And remember, this is where it starts to get really dark. Because even with 4 known victims now, Cassandra, Marquita, Crystal, and his own grandmother Beatrice, the sheriff is still out there saying the number might be higher. "I do believe that there is other victims," he told reporters. "We're hopeful that Richard Fox will hopefully try to ease his conscience a little bit and give us some more information." But the thing is, Fox isn't talking. No extra confessions, no remorse, just silence from behind those prison walls. But wait, it gets worse. Because while the courtroom gave the known families a measure of justice, there are other families across Western New York who still don't have answers. Cold cases from the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Women who vanished in Buffalo, Niagara Falls, and the surrounding towns. Women who might have crossed paths with the handyman who showed up with his toolbox and a smile. What they didn't know was that the man fixing their sink might have been the last person they ever saw. And just like that, the peaceful trail in Portland and the basement on Orleans Avenue aren't the end of the story. They're chapters in a book that might never be fully closed. To this day, the Chautauqua Rails to Trails in Portland looks the same as it always did. Hikers still walk that path. Families still enjoy the leaves crunching under their boots. But now they know what was buried there. And just like that, a simple Saturday morning hike changed everything. It pulled 4 lives, and possibly more, out of the darkness and forced us all to look at the quiet people around us a little closer. And with that, we close the book on the twisted paths of Richard Fox. Thank you for watching. Subscribe, hit the like button, and share for more raw global cases.